On the morning Cordelia Thorne Maddox was found dead in her bed, the village of Limpstone Parva already knew the story it wanted to tell. By tea time, that story had a suspect. By the end of the week, it had a confession. But the confession came from the wrong person, and the crime they confessed to was 41 years older than anyone in the room understood. Welcome to Marple Mysteries, where every village keeps its secrets and every secret keeps its time. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. A name, a town, a country. We love knowing who's settling in with us. And if you're new here, the little bell beside the subscribe button means you won't miss the next mystery when it comes calling. Now, pour yourself something warm. Settle in. The fog is just beginning to lift over Devon, and Miss Jane Marple is about to step down from the morning train. The fog had not lifted by 11, which Hester Calloway said was unusual for October, but the village seemed neither surprised nor inconvenienced, only quieter than it had been the week before. The way places become quiet when they are deciding what to remember. Miss Marple stepped down onto the small platform at Limpstone Halt, with her carpet bag in one hand and her umbrella in the other, and stood for a moment looking at the white, nothing where the village ought to have been. The station master, who knew Hester, took her larger case and walked her up the lane himself, lantern swinging from a hooked finger, though it was nearly midday. Hedges loomed and receded. Somewhere to their left, a dog barked once and stopped, as if the fog had absorbed even its conviction. "Mrs. Calloway said to bring you straight up," the station master said. He was perhaps 60, with the deferential courtesy of a man who had known 3 vicars and outlived 2. "She's been looking forward." "As have I," Miss Marple said. "Hester and I have not had a proper visit in nearly 2 years. Sad business about Mr. Calloway, yes." He did not press, which Miss Marple noted with approval. Some villages produced men who could leave a sentence alone. It was, in her experience, a reliable indicator of the quality of the village's clergy over the past 40 years. Hester's cottage stood at the end of Glebe Lane, a low stone house with a slate roof darkened by lichen and a front garden that had been competently neglected since the spring. Hester herself opened the door before Miss Marple had reached the gate. A tall, narrow woman of 68, in widow's grey, softened with a violet scarf at the throat. Her hair, which had been brown when Miss Marple last saw her, was now entirely white, and she had let it be white without apology. "Jane," she said, "come in out of it. The kettle's been on 3 times." The parlour was small and warm, and smelled of wood smoke and apples. Hester had set tea on the low table by the fire. Proper tea, with brown bread and butter, and a plate of small dark cakes, and a jar of damson jam that Miss Marple recognised with affection as Hester's own. "You've made yourself comfortable here," Miss Marple said, settling into the chair Hester indicated. "It suits you. It suits me better than I'd expected." Hester poured. "Arthur and I were here 31 years, you know, and I'd always thought of it as Arthur's place. His choice, his patch. After he went, I half thought I'd sell up and come closer to my sister in Salisbury, but the cottage held on to me, or I held on to it. One of those. Both, I expect." Both? Yes. Hester passed the cup. Now, before anyone calls in and starts your education for me, let me tell you who's who, so you'll have the map. Please. Hester took her own cup, sat, and began. The Thorns lived up at Thorn House. The older sister, Evangeline, called Evie, who ran the estate and the quarry, and Cordelia, the younger, widowed 18 months and come home to live. Cordelia is the kinder of the two, though Evie is the better woman, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple did. The vicar was Tony Pickard on his third wife, who was a Salisbury girl named Honoria, and not yet, after 4 years, considered local. Dr. Penhaligon practised from his late father's surgery, and was pleasant enough, but, Hester thought, a little weak. The postmistress was Iris Bligh, and what Iris doesn't know about you by Friday isn't worth knowing on Monday. And the household at Thorn House. Maggie Pell as housekeeper. She's been there since she was a girl, 50 years and more. Walks with a limp from a fall on the back stairs. Oh, the year after the war, I think it was. 48. And there's young Tom Verrall as gardener. He has the cottage at the bottom of the kitchen garden. Local boy. And Maggie, what is she like? Hester considered. Devoted. The sort of housekeeper who'd think it impertinent to die before her employers. Very quiet. Father's still alive. He's at Linden House, the nursing home up the Exeter Road. 94 if he's a day. Goodness! Yes, Maggie visits him every Wednesday, and doesn't speak of him otherwise. There was a knock at the kitchen door. 3 light raps. A pause. 1 more. Hester rose. That'll be her now, in fact. She said she'd bring down some vegetables when she heard you were coming. Miss Marple heard the door open, heard Hester's voice. Maggie, do come through. She's only just sat down. And heard, after a small interval, an uneven step in the passage. Maggie Pell appeared in the parlour doorway with a wicker basket on her arm. A small, neat woman of 70 or so, in a dark coat with the collar turned up against the fog, her grey hair drawn back severely under a brown felt hat. Her face was pleasant in the way that long competence makes a face pleasant. Settled, untroubled, giving nothing. "Miss Marple," she said, and inclined her head. "Welcome to Limpstone Parva. Miss Cordelia sent a few things from the garden. The leeks are particularly good this year. How very kind. And how very kind of you to bring them yourself." "It's no trouble." She set the basket down on the side table with care, and Miss Marple noticed the limp again as Maggie turned. A favouring of the right side, slight but settled, the kind of limp a body had made peace with long ago. "I won't stay. Mrs. Calloway, the apples in the orchard want picking before the rain comes in proper. I told Tom, but you know what he is. Thank you, Maggie." Maggie inclined her head once more and withdrew. The kitchen door closed softly. Miss Marple, from her chair by the fire, watched through the window as the small, dark figure crossed the lane and was taken back into the fog. She sat a moment longer with her tea cooling in her hand, and thought, without yet knowing why, that the village felt older than its houses. They walked up to Thorn House the next afternoon, when the fog had finally thinned to a high white haze, and the lane smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. Hester wore her good coat. Miss Marple wore the soft grey wool she kept for first calls, with the cameo at her throat that had been her mother's. "It's only a quarter-mile," Hester said, "but it always feels further. The drive does it. They planted those limes in 18-something, and now you can't see the house from the gate. Deliberate, I expect." "Oh, very." The Thorns have always preferred to be approached. The gate stood open between two stone pillars whose carved finials had weathered to soft shapes. The drive curved through the limes, bare now, their last yellow leaves underfoot, and opened onto a gravel sweep before a long, low house of grey stone, 3 stories with mullioned windows and a front door painted the dark green of holly leaves. 2 of the upstairs windows had their curtains half drawn. A thin column of smoke rose from the kitchen chimney and was caught and bent eastward by some current the lower air could not feel. "It wants paint," Miss Marple said quietly. "It wants a great deal more than paint. But yes." Maggie Pell opened the door before they had quite reached the step. She had changed her brown felt hat for a white cap and a long apron over her dark dress, and she received them with the same settled courtesy she had brought to Hester's parlour the day before. "Mrs. Calloway, Miss Marple, the ladies are in the morning room. May I take your coats?" She took them and hung them on the hall stand with the small, efficient movements of a woman who had done it 10,000 times. The hall was panelled in dark oak and smelled of beeswax and, very faintly, of damp. A long-case clock in the corner kept time with the unhurried tock of a mechanism cared for. On a side table stood a silver salver with 2 calling cards on it. Yesterday's, by the look of them, and beside it, where Miss Marple's eye caught it without looking for it, a pale rectangle in the wood where some other silver thing had stood for a long time and stood no longer. "This way, please." The morning room faced south and was the warmest room Miss Marple had been in since arriving. A fire burned in a small grate. Long curtains of faded rose damask were drawn back from the windows. A low table by the fire held a tea tray already prepared. 2 women rose as they came in. Evangeline Thorne was the taller, perhaps 5'8", with the long-boned look of women who had been handsome at 30 and had let handsomeness pass without trying to hold it. Her hair was iron grey, drawn back into a low knot. She wore a tweed skirt and a soft fawn jumper, and at her left wrist a man's wristwatch on a worn leather strap, the face turned inward in the old way. Her handshake was firm and brief. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Calloway has spoken of you. Welcome." "Thank you. It's very kind of you to receive us." Cordelia came forward more slowly. She was shorter, softer, the same iron-grey hair worn looser. Her eyes were the same colour as her sister's, a pale, clear blue, but set in a face that had kept its capacity for surprise. She wore a dark blue dress with a small enamel brooch at the collar, and she took Miss Marple's hand in both of hers. "Oh, I am glad," she said. "Hester has been threatening us with you for weeks. Do sit down. The fire is the only honest one in the house." "Cordelia," her sister said, with mild reproof. "Well, it is. The drawing-room fire smokes, and the library hasn't been lit since Tuesday." She turned back to Miss Marple. "Tea? Hester takes hers with lemon, I remember. And you? Milk, please, no sugar." Cordelia poured. Her hands were not entirely steady, but the unsteadiness had the quality of long habit rather than present nerves. The small tremor of a woman who had been carrying something heavier than tea trays for some years. Miss Marple, accepting her cup, observed the room while appearing to admire the fire. A piano against the far wall, closed, with no music on the stand. A wall of bookshelves, with one shelf noticeably emptier than the others, the remaining books fallen sideways into the gap. Above the mantel, a portrait of a man in Edwardian dress, heavy-jawed, fair, with the thorn-blue eyes, gazing out across the room as if mildly displeased with its current arrangement. "Your father?" Miss Marple asked. "Our father." Evie's voice was even. "Hubert Thorne. Painted in 1912, just before he stopped sitting for things. A striking face. He was a striking man." She said it without inflection. Cordelia, passing the brown bread, said nothing at all. Through the long window behind Cordelia's chair, Miss Marple could see down the slope of the lawn to a low stone wall, and beyond it the kitchen garden, where a man in a brown jacket was lifting something into a wheelbarrow. He worked without hurry. As Miss Marple watched, he straightened, set a hand to the small of his back, and looked up at the house. At this very window, perhaps, and then away again, and bent to his work. "Tom Verrall," Hester said quietly, following her glance. "Devoted to the garden," Cordelia said. "And the garden, on the whole, is devoted to him. We are very lucky." "We are very lucky in a great many things," Evie said, in a tone that closed the subject and refilled the teapot from the hot water jug. They stayed 3/4 of an hour. The talk moved across safe ground. The autumn, the church roof appeal, the new doctor at Linden House, a wedding in the next parish. Evie spoke well and briefly. Cordelia spoke more and laughed twice, and once put her hand to her chest in a small, unconscious gesture that Miss Marple noted and filed. When they rose to leave, Cordelia walked them to the door herself, ahead of Maggie. On the step, she took Miss Marple's hand again in both of hers, and held it a moment longer than the occasion required. "Do come again," she said. "It's nice to have someone new." Sunday came in clear and cold, the first true frost of the season, silvering the grass along Glebe Lane and tipping the late roses in Hester's garden with white. The church bell began at 20 to 10 and went on without hurry. 2 notes alternating, the kind of bell-ringing done by a man who has been doing it 40 years and means to do it another 10. St. Mary Magdalene stood at the top of the village, on a small rise above the green. It was older than most of the cottages, a squat Norman tower with a crooked weathercock, a nave that had been re-roofed in the 18th century and re-windowed in the 19th, and a churchyard whose oldest stones leaned at every angle the soil had permitted. Miss Marple, walking up the path on Hester's arm, read the names without meaning to. Pell, Thorne, Verrall, Bly. The same 6 families, again and again, with the dates climbing through 2 centuries. Inside, the church smelled of old stone and brass polish, and the particular cold that lives in country churches even in summer. Hester led the way to a pew halfway down on the south side. Miss Marple, settling in, took the small inventory she always took. The brasses on the chancel floor, the war memorial under the south window with its 2 columns of names, the embroidered kneelers in faded reds and blues. The congregation was thin, perhaps 30 souls, and weighted toward the elderly. Evie Thorne sat in the second pew on the north side, alone. Cordelia was not there. "Migraine?" Hester murmured, following her glance. "She gets them." Maggie sent word with the milk. The Reverend Anthony Pickard came in from the vestry as the bells stopped. He was a tall man with a long, mild face and the slightly stooped shoulders of a clergyman who had spent 40 years bending toward people shorter than himself. His voice, when he began the service, was a clear country baritone. Unfussy, well-pitched, the kind of voice that could read a difficult passage without making a meal of it. His sermon was on patience, and was 8 minutes long and ended before its welcome did. Miss Marple, who had heard a great many sermons on patience, approved. Afterwards, there was the usual slow procession at the door. Pickard shook each hand with the same attentive courtesy, asked after the right grandchild or hip or pullet, and let each parishioner go without holding them too long. When Hester introduced Miss Marple, he held her hand a fraction longer than the others. "Miss Marple, I have heard your name from a colleague at Chipping Cleghorn. He spoke very highly. That is kind of him. Would you like to see the church? It has a few things worth a look if you can spare the half hour." "I should like that very much." Hester, who had been intercepted by Mrs. Bligh at the Lich Gate, waved them on. Pickard led Miss Marple back through the porch into the dim of the nave. He showed her the brasses. A 14th century knight, a 16th century wool merchant, and his wife, and the small Saxon font that had been turned up in the churchyard during drainage works in 1889. He spoke well about each, with the affectionate accuracy of a man who had read his own guidebook. "And the parish records?" Miss Marple asked. I confess to a weakness. "In the vestry. Come through." The vestry was small and damp, with a single high window and a long oak cupboard along one wall. Pickard unlocked the cupboard with a key from a ring at his belt and brought down a heavy ledger bound in dark leather. "Baptisms. We have them continuous from 1680. With one gap during the Commonwealth and a few pages water-damaged in the 1840s. He set the ledger on the small table and opened it with care. "Marriages and burials are in the other 2. What did you wish to look for?" "Nothing in particular. I find the rhythm of a parish register restful." He smiled. "Restful is not the word most would choose. But I take your meaning." He turned pages for her. The hand changed across the centuries. Copperplate giving way to a tighter Victorian script, then to the looser modern hand of Pickard's predecessor. Miss Marple read slowly, taking in names, occupations, the small parenthetical notes that country incumbents had always added. Of the mill, of hire farm, base-born Mother Jane Tucker. The Pells appeared regularly, labourers mostly, with the occasional Carter or Thatcher. The Thorns appeared in a different ink, as if the register itself acknowledged the distinction. She turned a page and stopped. The year was 1915. The hand was the same throughout, a careful sloping script, the incumbent of the day. The entries ran neatly down the column from January through September. Then, between an entry dated the 14th of September and the next, dated the 22nd of November, there was a small interval of blank ruled lines. 3 lines. Perhaps 4. Just enough for an entry that had not been made, in a register that otherwise wasted no space. Miss Marple did not put her finger on it. She let her eye pass on and come back, as if mildly curious about a smudge. "A quiet autumn," she said. "I beg your pardon? 1915. Rather a gap between September and November. One thinks of the war, of course, so many of the young men gone." Pickard looked at the page. He looked at it for what Miss Marple judged to be a little longer than the question required, and when he spoke his voice had not quite the easy fluency it had carried through the brasses. Yes, the war took a great deal out of the village. Some years are thinner than others." "Of course." He closed the ledger gently and returned it to the cupboard and locked the cupboard and turned back to her with his clergyman's smile restored and asked whether she had seen the Jacobean pulpit, which he thought she would like. She had. She told him so and praised it accurately. He walked her back to the porch, and they parted at the Leach Gate with civilities on both sides. Mrs. Bligh, still there, attached herself at once to Miss Marple's other arm for the walk down the lane, and began the village's education of her in earnest. Miss Marple listened, and nodded in the right places, and noted that her own mind had returned, twice without instruction, to the name Pell. Linden House stood 1.5 miles up the Exeter Road, set back behind a beech hedge that had been cut into a low wall, wide enough for the doctor's car and the undertaker's when each came. It had been a gentleman's house once. 3 bays, sash windows, a pediment over the door with the date 1798 picked out in lead. Now a brass plate beside the door read Linden House, Residential Home for the Elderly, Matron, Miss B. Holloway, S.R.N., and the long lawn at the side had been laid out with benches and a path for those residents who could still walk it. Hester had a friend there, an old Miss Probin, who had been her piano teacher in 1925, and was now 89, and bedridden and pleased by any visitor. And she had asked Miss Marple to come along on the Wednesday afternoon visit. "She won't remember you've not met before," Hester said in the car, "but she remembers the names of every pupil she ever had. It's a peculiar sort of memory. The recent things go, and the old things stay sharper than they ever were. I have noticed it in others. Yes. Well, you'll find her gentle." Sister Holloway received them in the small front office that had once been a morning room. She was a brisk, square-built woman of 56 or so, in a starched white cap and a dark blue dress, with the unhurried competence of a woman who had nursed in larger institutions and chosen this smaller one for reasons of her own. She greeted Hester by name and shook Miss Marple's hand with a grip that was firm without testing. "Miss Probin is in the day-room this afternoon." She insisted on being moved down. "She has been telling everyone since breakfast that Mrs. Calloway was coming." "Bless her! I'll take you through." The day-room was long, south-facing, with 3 tall windows and a coal fire at the far end. A dozen residents sat in armchairs ranged about the room, most reading, two playing cards at a small table, one asleep with her knitting in her lap. The air was warm and faintly medicinal. Miss Probin, in the chair nearest the fire, gave a small cry of pleasure at the sight of Hester, and held out both hands. Miss Marple, while Hester bent to her old teacher, let her eye travel the room, and in the chair by the second window, half in sunlight, sat an old man. He was very old. His hair was the white that has passed beyond white into something nearly translucent, and his hands, folded on the rug across his knees, were the hands of a man who had worked outdoors for 60 years and indoors for 30. His eyes were open and very pale, and he was looking at nothing in particular, or at something a great distance off. The shape of his jaw and the set of his mouth had the same quiet, settled quality Miss Marple had observed 2 days before in a small woman with a brown felt hat. "Mr. Pell," she said quietly to Sister Holloway, who had remained at her elbow. "Yes, Silas Pell, Maggie's father. He's been with us 3 years." 94, I believe Mrs. Calloway said. 94 next month. He came to us very sound, sharp as anything, but it has gone from him this past year. Most days he is somewhere else. Some days he is here. He looks peaceful. He is, on the whole. He has his moments. He speaks sometimes of an orchard, quite urgently, as if there were something he must say about it, and then it passes, and he doesn't know what he meant. Miss Marple turned her head a fraction. "An orchard?" "Yes. We've never made out which one. There were 3 at the old Thorn place, you know, in the days he worked there. He was orchard man for the family. 50 years and more before his hip went. How interesting. Maggie comes every Wednesday, regular as the post. She'll be in this afternoon. She doesn't like him to be disturbed, she says. So we let him sit. Of course, she let her gaze pass on as she had let it pass on from the gap in the ledger, and she turned her full attention to Miss Probin, and spent the next hour being introduced and reintroduced to a small bright woman who had taught the minuet in G to 2 generations of Devon children and could still hum it through without a stumble. She did not look again at the old man by the window. She did not need to. The room had given her what she required of it for one afternoon. They came down to Thorn House on the way home. Hester had promised Cordelia some windfalls from her own tree for a pie, and Cordelia had asked in return whether Hester would take a basket of the late beans up to the bring and buy. Maggie met them at the kitchen door. "Miss Cordelia is lying down. She said you were to go through and help yourselves. The beans are on the scullery table. Thank you, Maggie. We shan't disturb her." In the scullery, a low flagged room off the kitchen, smelling of soap and onion skins, Hester began packing the hamper. Halfway through she paused. "Oh, bother. The vicar's wife wants bicarbonate for the cake stall. I said I'd put a tin in. Jane, would you? There should be one in the dresser, second shelf, behind the salt." Miss Marple went to the dresser. The second shelf held the salt jar, a packet of starch, 2 tins of mustard, a brown paper twist that smelled faintly of cloves, and at the back a tin of bicarbonate of soda with a faded blue label. She reached for it. Her hand checked, very slightly, halfway. Behind the bicarbonate, pushed well back against the wood of the dresser, stood a second tin. Smaller, plainer, with no label at all. The tin had been placed in a way that suggested it was meant not to be seen by a casual hand. Miss Marple did not draw it forward. She took the bicarbonate, closed her hand around it, and turned back to Hester at the table. "Here we are. Bless you. Right. That's everything." They walked home in the long blue dusk. Miss Marple was very quiet. That evening, at her bedroom window, she heard the church bell strike 10 across the still air, and felt, without yet being able to name the reason, uneasy. Thursday came in grey and still, with the kind of low cloud that promises rain by evening and delivers it precisely at dusk. Miss Marple spent the morning writing letters at Hester's small bureau, and the early afternoon in the garden, helping Hester lift the last of the dahlia tubers before the frost took them. By 3:30 the wind had dropped entirely, and the air had the soft, suspended quality of a day waiting to break. "We're due at Thorn House at 4, Hester said, dusting her hands on her apron. Cordelia particularly asked. She said Evie was up at the quarry all afternoon, and she wanted company before the rain came in. "How is she today?" "Better," Maggie said this morning. "She had a quiet day yesterday and slept well. The migraines come and go. She's had them for years." "And the heart?" Hester looked at her sharply. Miss Marple was untying her apron with a mild face. "You noticed?" "The little gesture, yes. When she laughed the other day. Yes, she's had a weak heart since she was 40. Penhaligon's father started her on digitalis years ago, and young Penhaligon keeps her on it. A small dose, regular, every morning. She doesn't make much of it. But she knows, and Evie knows, and Maggie knows." "I see." They walked up the lane in their good coats. The lime drive was darker today than it had been on Tuesday, the bare branches netting a sky already lowering toward purple. The green front door was opened by Maggie before they had reached the step. "Mrs. Calloway." "Miss Marple. Miss Cordelia is in the morning room. She has the fire up." The morning room was as warm as before, and Cordelia rose from her chair by the fire with both hands held out. She looked, Miss Marple thought, a little pale beneath the surface colour the fire had given her, but her eyes were bright and her welcome unforced. "You are angels, both of you. Sit down. Sit down. Maggie, would you bring the tea now? And the seed cake. There's a fresh one." "Yes, Miss Cordelia." They settled. Cordelia spoke of small things. A letter from a cousin in Yorkshire, the church roof appeal. A fox that had been at the hens the night before. She asked Miss Marple about St. Mary Mead, and listened to the answer with the attention of a woman who has spent 18 months mostly indoors and is hungry for the geographies of other people's lives. Tea came, and seed cake, and Cordelia poured. About 4:30, a clock somewhere in the house struck the half, and Cordelia set down her cup. "Oh, I had quite forgotten. I promised young Mr. Verrall a glass of sherry before he goes home tonight. He has been clearing the orchard ditch in this weather all week, and I said when the rain came I should stand him a drink for it. Excuse me a moment." She rose and went through the connecting door into the small drawing-room next door. The door did not quite close behind her. From where Miss Marple sat, in the chair angled toward the fire, with the long window behind her left shoulder. She could see through the gap of the doorway and at a long oblique a narrow slice of the drawing-room beyond. The corner of a sideboard, the edge of a tall lamp, and the figure of Cordelia at the sideboard with her back half turned. Cordelia took down a decanter and poured. She poured carefully. 2 glasses, set the decanter back, and turned with 1 glass in each hand towards someone Miss Marple could not see. Someone standing in the part of the drawing-room hidden by the door's edge. Cordelia smiled, the smile of a hostess pleased with a small kindness, and extended the glass. A hand came forward and took it. Only a hand, briefly, a man's hand in a brown jacket sleeve, weathered, the knuckles enlarged. Then the door swung gently to on its own hinge, and Miss Marple saw no more. Hester, who had been telling a long anecdote about a christening in 1937, had noticed nothing at all. Cordelia came back 5 minutes later, alone, faintly flushed, and resumed her seat. She did not mention the sherry, and Miss Marple did not ask. The talk turned to the bring and buy on Saturday. The rain began at 5:20. First a few large drops against the long window, then settling into a steady drum on the gravel sweep. By 6 o'clock it was full dark, and Hester stood up. "We must let you have your evening, my dear. Tell Evie we called." "I shall. Thank you for coming." "Truly." Maggie brought their coats. Cordelia walked them as far as the inner hall, and pressed Miss Marple's hand again at parting. Not as long as on Tuesday, but with the same quality of holding. They went home through the rain under Hester's largest umbrella, and were glad of the fire. It was Mrs. Iris Bligh, walking her dog Trixie up the lane at 9:25 that evening, who saw Tom Verrill leave Thornhouse by the kitchen door. She had stopped under the lich gate to let Trixie investigate something, and from there she had a clear sight of the side of the house across the wet gravel. The kitchen door opened, throwing a yellow rectangle onto the wet stone of the yard, and Tom came out. Bareheaded, his brown jacket collar turned up against the rain, and pulled the door to behind him. He stood a moment on the step, as if collecting himself, and then walked off down the path to the kitchen garden gate without looking up. The door behind him stayed closed. The yellow rectangle was gone. Mrs. Bligh noted the time by the church clock, which struck the half almost as Tom reached the gate, and she filed the observation. There would, she felt, be a use for it. There usually was. At 10 o'clock, in the kitchen of Thorn House, Maggie Pell stood at the deep stone sink with her sleeves pushed up to the elbow. The house above her was quiet. Miss Cordelia had gone up at 9:45 with her glass of warm milk, as she always did. Miss Evangeline was not yet home from the quarry meeting in Exeter. On the wooden draining board beside, Maggie stood a single sherry glass. She washed it carefully in hot water, dried it on the linen cloth, and held it up to the gaslight to be sure of it. Then she carried it through to the drawing-room, opened the cabinet, and set it back among the others. She closed the cabinet door without a sound and returned to the kitchen. She damped the fire, turned out the gas, and went up the back stairs to bed. Maggie found her at 7:20. She had taken up the morning tray, as she had taken it up every morning for 18 months. Weak china tea, 1 slice of dry toast, the small white pill in its saucer. She had knocked once at the bedroom door, as she always did, and waited a moment and gone in. The curtains were still drawn. The bedside lamp had been left burning low through the night. Miss Cordelia lay on her side, facing the lamp, one hand curled near her cheek on the pillow, the other resting on the turned-back edge of the sheet. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was very slightly open. She had not stirred at the knock, and she did not stir at the tray. Maggie set the tray on the chest of drawers without hurry. She crossed to the bed and looked down at Miss Cordelia for what one of the maids, called up 2 minutes later, afterwards described as a long moment. Mrs. Calloway, but a calm one, like a person checking the weather through a window. Then she went out onto the landing and called for the girl, and asked her to fetch Miss Evangeline at once, and to send the boot boy down to the village on his bicycle for Dr. Penhaligon. By 8 o'clock the doctor was at the bedside. By 1:15, Evie was at the foot of the bed, in her dressing gown, with her hair down her back, and the doctor was straightening up and saying, things doctors say, when there is no surprise to be managed, only a fact to be confirmed. It will have been the heart. She would have known very little. I am very sorry, Miss Thorne. Evie said, "Thank you, doctor," in a voice that had been steadied by 50 years of practice, and turned and walked out of the room and down the corridor to her own bedroom, and shut the door. Penhaligon signed the certificate at the writing desk in the morning room, with the fire not yet lit and the curtains not yet drawn. He wrote cardiac failure, and the date, and his name, and he gave the certificate to Maggie, who put it in the drawer of the hall table, where such things had always been kept in the Thorne house. By 9 the village knew. Mrs. Bligh, opening the post office at 9 sharp, heard it from the milk lad, who had heard it from the boot boy at Penhaligon's gate, and by 9:30 she had given it, with appropriate gravity, to 4 customers, and the postman. Hester heard it at 20 to 10 from the postman, on the doorstep, with a letter in his hand he had quite forgotten to deliver. She came back into the parlour without the letter, and Miss Marple, looking up from her embroidery, knew at once. Cordelia, yes. In the night. Maggie found her at 7. Miss Marple put down the embroidery. She sat for a moment with her hands folded in her lap, and her face had the small, settled stillness it took on when she was setting something carefully aside in order to deal with what was in front of her. "The poor dear," she said, and Evie, yes, we must go up. Not now, later. They will not want callers this morning. But by this afternoon someone should go who is not asking anything. Yes. They went at 3. The lime drive was wet, the gravel sweep dark with the night's rain, and the dark green door was opened, as it had been opened on Tuesday and on Thursday, by Maggie. She had put a band of black crape on her sleeve. Her face was the face she had brought into the parlour on the first morning, settled, untroubled, giving nothing, and her voice when she spoke was a careful half-tone lower than it had been the day before. "Mrs. Calloway, Miss Marple, Miss Evangeline is in the library," she said. Anyone who came was to be brought through. Evie was at her father's desk, by the window with a small stack of letters on the blotter, and a pen in her hand that she was not using. She rose when they came in, and Miss Marple saw at once that the steadiness in the bedroom had cost her something, and that the cost was being paid now in the privacy of paperwork. "Hester! Miss Marple, thank you for coming, my dear." Hester crossed the room and embraced her briefly, and Evie returned the embrace in the manner of a woman who had not been held by many people in her life and was uncertain, even at 67, what to do with her arms. Miss Marple stayed by the door and gave them the moment. Then she came forward and took Evie's hand, and said only, "I am so very sorry. We had been looking forward to knowing her better. She liked you. She said so last night, after you'd gone." Evie's voice did not break, but it thinned. "She said it had been a good afternoon. I am glad of that. Yes, so am I. They stayed 20 minutes. Hester did most of the talking, the small practical questions, the offers of help. The names of people Evie should not have to remember to write to herself." Evie answered each in turn, with the competence she had brought to everything for 40 years, and Miss Marple watched her and was sorry for her, and watched, too, the door to the hall, through which Maggie passed twice with a tray, and once as with a folded cloth, on errands that did not entirely need doing at that hour. On the way out, Miss Marple paused in the upper hall. Maggie had gone ahead to fetch their coats, and her eye, passing along the corridor that led to the back stairs, caught on an open door. It was Maggie's own room. The door stood ajar, perhaps 4 inches. Inside, Miss Marple could see the foot of a narrow iron bedstead, a strip of clean rag rug, and, on the wall above a small chest of drawers, a framed photograph. It was a young woman in Edwardian dress, high-collared blouse, a piled mass of hair, a face turned 3/4 to the camera. She was perhaps 19 or 20. Her expression was grave and direct. Miss Marple, who had a long memory for faces, and a longer one for the way certain bones repeated themselves down a family, registered the photograph and read it, in that first half-second, as a portrait of a young Maggie Pell. She heard Maggie's step on the stair below and moved on. In the cab home, with Hester silent beside her, Miss Marple was thinking, though she did not yet quite know it, about Evie, about the cost of competence, and about the small inheritance that would now come to her, and about how grief in some women looked, from the outside, very like a kind of relief. She was, in this, briefly and entirely wrong. The doorbell at Hester's cottage rang at 4:30. It was a constable from Much Benham, with a polite message. Inspector Slack would be calling at Thornhouse in the morning, and would be obliged if Mrs. Calloway and her guest would make themselves available for a brief word at their convenience. Inspector Slack arrived at Thornhouse at 9:20 the following morning, in a black car driven by a sergeant, and proceeded through the next 4 hours to confirm, in the village's estimation, every impression the village had ever formed of policemen from Much Benham. Hester and Miss Marple heard the broad outline of it from Mrs. Bligh, who had heard it from the boot boy, who had been kept running between the kitchen door and the back gate with messages all morning, and had missed almost nothing. By 1:30 they had a more orderly account from Penhaligon, who came down to Hester's cottage on his way back to the surgery and accepted a cup of tea with the air of a man who needed it. "He's a thorough man, the inspector," Penhaligon said, in a tone that managed not to be a compliment. "Thorough and rapid." "Rapid in what direction?" Miss Marple asked. "That, Miss Marple, is what concerns me." He set down his cup. "Look, Cordelia died of heart failure. I have been her doctor for 5 years. My father was her doctor for 30 before that. She had a known cardiac weakness. She was on digitalis. She had had 3 significant episodes in the last decade. It is the death I should have predicted for her, and I am not surprised by it. I signed the certificate without hesitation, and I would sign it again." But Mrs. Bligh told the inspector before he had been in the village 2 hours that she had seen Tom Verrall leaving the house by the kitchen door at 9:30 the night before. And the inspector then asked the household whether anyone had had a visitor in the drawing-room that evening, and Maggie said no, that no one had called after tea. Hester said sharply, "But that isn't true." Cordelia poured sherry. Jane saw her. "I saw her pour 2 glasses, yes," Miss Marple said. "I did not see for whom. Quite." Penhaligon ran a hand across his face. And then the inspector noticed, or rather, his sergeant noticed, that there is a small wet ring on the bedside table beside the lamp in Cordelia's bedroom, of a size and shape consistent with a sherry glass having stood there overnight. But there is no glass, and the cabinet downstairs has its full set of 12. Ah! So, in the inspector's mind, Miss Marple, the picture is this. Tom Verrall came up to the house in the evening. Cordelia, who was fond of him, took him through to the drawing-room and gave him a glass of sherry. They went up to her bedroom, or he went up afterwards. Something occurred. He left at 9:30 by the kitchen door, having washed his glass on the way out, and put it back in the cabinet to conceal his presence. Cordelia died in the night. The half-glass on the bedside is hers. The missing glass, washed and returned, is his. And the cause of death? He has not got that far. He is interested first in establishing the visit. He has been interviewing Tom for the past 2 hours. And Tom? Tom, Penhaligon said carefully, began by denying that he had been in the house at all yesterday evening. Hester closed her eyes. Quite. By the time Mrs. Bligh's evidence was put to him, he had been caught in the lie, and his attempts to recover it have not improved his position. The inspector now also has, from one of the quarry men, an account of certain arrangements between Tom and the quarry foreman concerning pheasants that were not strictly the quarry's to dispose, none of which has anything to do with Cordelia, but all of which is being treated as material to character. Where is Tom now? At the police house in Much Benham. Not charged. Not yet. Helping with enquiries. There was a small silence in Hester's parlour. The fire shifted. Outside, the rain that had begun in the night had set in for the day, fine and steady. "Doctor," Miss Marple said, "tell me, when you signed the certificate, was there anything at all, however small, that gave you pause?" Penhaligon looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "And that, Miss Marple, is the truth. She lay in her bed as a woman with a weak heart lies when the heart has stopped. There was no disorder. There was no sign of struggle. Her face was peaceful. The bedclothes were as Maggie said she had left them. If you had asked me at 8 o'clock yesterday morning to predict, on the medical evidence alone, what had happened in that room, I should have told you exactly what I wrote on the certificate, and I should have been content to be tested on it. The inspector's theory does not arise from the medicine. It arises from the gardener. Thank you. That is what I wanted to know. He left soon after. Hester saw him to the door and came back to the fire and sat down heavily. Jane, they cannot really think Tom. Hester, they can, and they do. Miss Marple's voice was very even, and we shall not help him by being indignant on his behalf. We shall help him, if we can help him at all, by being patient and exact. Yes, yes, of course. The afternoon brought, in the way afternoons in villages do, the rest of it. Tom was kept at Much Benham overnight. By the next morning the village had its story. It was not unkind, exactly. The village had liked Tom Verrall. But the village had also, for 2 years and more, observed the quality of his attention to Cordelia Thorne Maddox, and had drawn the conclusions the quality of his attention had invited it to draw. It had been a thing spoken of in kitchens. Now the thing spoken of in kitchens had a death attached to it, and the village rearranged its impression of Tom with the small, regretful efficiency of a community that prefers a complete story to an incomplete one. Within 48 hours of Cordelia's death, 4 separate women had told Mrs. Bligh that they had always thought there was something not quite right about that young man, and Mrs. Bligh, who could remember each of them praising him in the past 12 months, did not contradict them. By Saturday tea-time, Tom had been charged. The charge was manslaughter, not murder. Slack had decided, on Penhaligon's continued resistance, that he could not stretch to murder without a clearer mechanism, and had settled on a theory involving emotional pressure on a woman with a known weak heart. It was a poor theory, and Slack knew it was a poor theory, but a charge was a charge, and he meant to hold the gardener while he looked for better. That evening, alone in Hester's parlour after Hester had gone up to bed, Miss Marple sat by the dying fire, with her hands folded in her lap. She thought of Cordelia at the sideboard with 2 glasses in her hands. She thought of Mrs. Bligh's sighting at 9:30. She thought of Maggie's face at the door on the afternoon of the visit. Settled, untroubled, giving nothing. She thought, the village has agreed on this story too quickly, and underneath that thought, quietly, was another. Someone has wanted it to. It rained through Sunday and into Monday, and the village stayed mostly indoors with its story. Miss Marple went to morning service alone. Hester had a cold coming on, and sat in the same pew as the week before, and watched Evie Thorne sit very upright in the second pew on the north side, alone, through the whole of the service, and walk out at the end without speaking to anyone. Reverend Pickard preached on forgiveness. He preached it well and briefly, and Miss Marple, who had heard a great many sermons on forgiveness, thought this one had been written by a man who had something particular in mind and had not been able to bring himself to name it. On Monday afternoon the rain thinned to a drizzle, and Hester, restored by hot lemon and an extra blanket, declared she would walk a little or go mad. They put on their coats and went up the back lane that climbed behind the cottage, where the hedges were high, and the views, where they opened, ran across the wet fields toward the quarry. They walked for some way in silence. Then Miss Marple, in the tone of a woman following a small thought through to its end, said, "Hester, Maggie's limp. You told me the first day that she had it from a fall on the back stairs." "Yes, the year after the war, 48. You are sure of the back stairs?" Hester slowed. The drizzle ran from the brim of her hat. She did not answer at once. "Now you say it. No, no, I'm not." "Why should I have said the back stairs? I don't know that I ever was told the back stairs. It must have been Iris Bligh or one of them. People say things and you remember them." She frowned at the wet lane. "It was October, I do remember that. The apples were in. And I remember, yes, I remember now, because Arthur and I had taken a basket up to thank her for something, I forget what. I remember Cordelia saying Maggie had been reaching for a tall stem and the ladder had gone, and she'd come down hard on her hip in the kitchen garden. A tall stem. That was the phrase. I remember thinking at the time, what tall stem in October? But Cordelia was vague about that sort of thing. Why? No reason in particular. It came back to me. They walked on. The lane turned at the top of the rise and gave them briefly a view down toward Linden House, behind its beech hedge, a mile across the wet fields. Miss Marple stopped, looking at it. "Hester, I think I shall walk down to Linden House this afternoon and sit a little while with Mr. Pell. I shall take some of the late roses, if you can spare them." "Of course. But why Silas Pell?" Sister Holloway said he had been an orchard man at Thorn House for many years. I should like to ask him about the orchard. Hester gave her a long, considering look, and did not ask anything else. Sister Holloway received her without surprise. "He is in the day-room. He has been quiet today, but he is awake. You may have a quarter of an hour with him, if you like. I shouldn't promise more." "He tires. A quarter of an hour will do very well. Thank you." She sat down beside Silas Pell in the chair by the second window, and laid the roses on the small table between them, and waited. He turned his head slowly, and his pale eyes found her, and for a long moment seemed to be looking at her from some distance. Then they steadied, and he was, for the first time since she had seen him, present in the room. "You're a new one," he said. His voice was thin but clear. "I don't know you. My name is Jane Marple. I am staying with Mrs. Calloway in the village for a little while. I have brought you some roses from her garden." He looked at the roses. He nodded once gravely, as if acknowledging a courtesy from long ago. "That's kind. Mr. Pell, Sister Holloway tells me you were the orchard man at Thorn House for a great many years." A small change passed over his face. Not alarm exactly, but a kind of careful attention. "I was, 60 year and over. Before the First War and after the Second. Then you must know the orchards very well. There were 3, I am told. 3. The big one west of the house, and the small one south, and the old one. The old one was by the terrace. They took it out, in the 20s. After everything, after everything. He looked at her. His mouth worked once. He said, almost in a whisper, "My Maggie doesn't like me to talk about the orchard." "Mr. Pell, I am not Maggie, and I think perhaps it would do you good to talk about it once, to someone who has not heard it before." He looked at her for a long time. The day room around them was quiet. 2 residents asleep, 1 reading, the fire shifting in the grate at the far end. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and a thin, cold sun had come out and was laying a pale square on the rug at their feet. "It was October," he said. "1915. The apples were in. I was on the long ladder in the old orchard, the one by the terrace, picking the late russets. The terrace was above me, about 15 foot up, with the balustrade. Mrs. Thorne, Mrs. Eleanor, was on the terrace with her brother, Mr. Vivian, from up Tiverton way. They didn't know I was down there. The leaves were still thick." He paused. His hand moved on the rug across his knees, smoothing it. "They were talking about my Annie. She was in the kitchen here, at the house, as kitchen maid. She was 19. She was in trouble, sir, by Mr. Hubert. Mrs. Eleanor had found it out. She was telling her brother where she'd send Annie. A place she knew of. In Somerset. She said the name. I don't recall the name now. And she said, these were the words, she said, and if she doesn't come back, well." His pale eyes had not left Miss Marple's face. "My Annie didn't come back, miss. She died there at the home in the November. The child lived. They sent it to people in Bristol. I don't know to who. I told my Maggie. I told her when she was old enough. I shouldn't have, perhaps, but I did. How old was Maggie when you told her? 22, 23. After she'd gone into service at the house herself. And she stayed in service there. She stayed." He looked down at the roses on the table. "My Maggie doesn't like me to talk about it. She gets fretful. She says no one wants to hear about old things now. Thank you, Mr. Pell. Thank you for telling me." She sat with him a little while longer in silence, until his eyes drifted toward the window, and the present went out of them again. Then she rose, very quietly, and let herself out. She walked back to Hester's, through the cold sun along the wet lanes, and she did not hurry. At Hester's kitchen table, with the kettle on, she took a sheet of paper and a pencil from the drawer of the dresser and wrote, slowly, a short list of names. Annie Pell, Eleanor Thorne, Hubert Thorne, Maggie, Cordelia, Evie. She looked at the list for a long time, and then she folded the paper once and put it in the pocket of her cardigan. She slept badly and was glad to wake to a clear sky. Tuesday came in cold and bright, with the kind of high-washed light October gives only after a day of rain. Miss Marple was at the breakfast table by 7:30. By 8 she had drafted, on the back of an envelope, a small list of things to do, in the order they would need to be done. By 9 she had walked up to the vicarage. Honoria Pickard opened the door in a cardigan and a slight flush, and went to fetch her husband from his study with the quick, careful movements of a woman who had been told there was a visitor, and did not yet know what kind. Pickard came out drying his hands on a handkerchief. He took Miss Marple through to the study and closed the door himself. "Miss Marple, you will forgive me. I rather wondered if you might come. That is good of you, Vicar. May I ask you a direct question? You may. In the parish register in the autumn of 1915, between September and November, there is a small gap of 3 or 4 blank ruled lines. Not a missing page, not a damaged page. Simply a space in a register that otherwise keeps no space. Will you tell me what was meant to go there? He sat down at his desk. He looked for a moment as if he had been carrying something heavy and had been waiting for someone to ask him to set it down. I was the curate here then, he said. Old Mr. Whittaker was the incumbent. He was 78 and not well, and a great deal of the parish work fell to me. I took most of the baptisms that year. There was one, in the October, that was not, in the end, entered. The child had been born at a private nursing home in Somerset to a young woman who had died in the birth. The arrangements for the child were made by Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, in whose household the mother had been employed. The child was baptized by me, privately, in this church on a Wednesday morning, with Mrs. Thorne and her solicitor as the only witnesses, before being taken on by train the same afternoon to a couple in Bristol who had agreed to receive it. I was instructed, on Mrs. Thorne's particular request, and with Mr. Whittaker's agreement, that the baptism was not to be entered in the parish register. I was very young. I did as I was told. I have thought about it, Miss Marple, every October of my life since. The mother's name, Annie Pell, and the child? A girl. We called her Mary for the day. What name she was given afterwards I do not know. Thank you, Vicar. I am very sorry to have asked. It was necessary. I am almost glad to have answered. He looked up at her. May I ask why? Not yet soon. I would be obliged if you would not mention this conversation to anyone, including Mrs. Pickard, until the end of the week. You have my word. From the vicarage she walked down to the post office. Mrs. Bligh was behind the counter, and on any other morning Miss Marple would have surrendered to the village's education for at least a quarter of an hour. But this morning she made her telephone call and her purchase, and was out again in under 10 minutes. The call had been to the office of Mr. Edmund Trescott, solicitor, in Exeter. The instruction had been brief. Would Mr. Trescott be so kind as to wire the registrar at Taunton for confirmation of the death of one Annie Pell of Limpstone Parva in Devon at a private nursing home in Somerset in November 1915, and would he telephone Mrs. Calloway's number at Limpstone Parva as soon as he had the answer? Trescott, who had been at school with Cordelia's late husband, asked no questions. He said he would have it by the afternoon. She went up to Thorne House at 11 on the pretext of returning a basket. Maggie answered the door. Miss Marple! Miss Evangeline is in the library. I shan't disturb her, only to leave the basket. Maggie, would you be very kind? I have left my handkerchief upstairs somewhere from yesterday. I think on the landing chest. May I run up? Of course. She went up the wide front stairs without hurry, and at the top of the landing turned left along the corridor toward the back of the house. Maggie's door was closed today. Miss Marple opened it. The photograph was where it had been. She took it down, turned it over, and saw in a small, careful hand on the back of the brown paper backing, in faded brown ink, Annie Pell, April 1915. She replaced it precisely. She closed the door precisely. She went back along the corridor and down the stairs with her own handkerchief, which had been in her sleeve the whole time, drawn out for visibility, and she gave Evie a moment of company in the library, and was out of the house again in 20 minutes. She went round to the kitchen door before she left. Maggie was in the scullery scouring a pan. "Maggie, I am sorry. Mrs. Calloway has run out of bicarbonate again. The cake stall on Saturday. Might I be a nuisance and take a spoonful from your tin?" "Take the whole tin, Miss Marple. I have another." "Bless you. I shan't be a moment." In the scullery she took down the bicarbonate tin from the dresser. Behind it, exactly where it had stood on the day of the bring and buy, was the second tin, small, plain, unlabelled. She lifted it. It was light, but not empty. She slipped it into the deep inside pocket of her coat. She took the bicarbonate as well, called her thanks to Maggie through the kitchen door, and walked home down the lime drive in the cold, bright sun without looking back at the house. Trescott telephoned at 3:20. Annie Pell, spinster, of Limpstone Parva, Devon, had died at the Beech Lawn Nursing Home, near Wellington in Somerset, on the 14th of November, 1915. Cause of death, puerperal sepsis. Age 20. The certificate was signed by a Dr. A.C. Massingham, since deceased. There was no record of any inquest. "Thank you, Mr. Trescott. You have been very kind." "Miss Marple, is there something I should know?" "Yes, but not over the telephone, and not today. I shall write to you tomorrow." She put down the receiver and sat for a moment in Hester's small hall with her hand still on it. Then she took the small unlabelled tin from her coat pocket, carried it through to the kitchen, and set it carefully in the middle of the kitchen table. She lifted the lid. Inside, finely chopped and almost entirely dried, lay perhaps 2 ounces of leaf. Dark green-grey, slightly curled, with the unmistakable furred underside and the long midrib of the foxglove. She closed the tin. She left it on the table. She went through to the hall and asked the operator for the police house at Much Benham, and when Inspector Slack came on the line, she said very politely that she believed she had something he would wish to see, and would he be so good as to call at Mrs. Calloway's cottage the following afternoon at 3, and would he also be so good, in the meantime, as to release Mr. Verrall on the strongest available bail, because Mr. Verrall had not killed anybody, and Inspector Slack would shortly be glad that he had not committed himself further in that direction. Inspector Slack, on the other end of the line, was briefly very quiet. Then he said, "I shall be there at 3, Miss Marple." She thanked him and rang off, and went back into the kitchen to put the kettle on. She went up to Thorn House the next afternoon at 2:30. The day was the same hard, clear cold as the day before, with a low sun that laid long shadows across the lime drive and picked out in unforgiving light every place where the paint on the green door had blistered and the gravel had thinned to bare earth. Inspector Slack's black car was already in the lane below the gate, drawn in tight against the hedge so as not to be seen from the house. Slack himself and the sergeant were walking up the drive 20 paces behind her. The arrangement had been settled by telephone that morning. She had asked Maggie through Hester earlier, whether she might call in privately on a small matter. The answer had come back at once. Miss Marple is welcome any time she likes. Miss Evangeline is at the solicitor's in Exeter all afternoon. It was the answer Miss Marple had expected. Maggie opened the door herself. She had the small black armband still on her sleeve. Her face was the face it had been on the morning of the death, settled, untroubled, the face of a woman who had decided long ago what her face would be. "Miss Marple, come through. I am in the scullery. I am shelling the last of the peas for tonight. Will you come and sit a moment? The kitchen is warm." "Thank you, Maggie. I should like that very much." She followed Maggie down the passage. The kitchen was as warm as Maggie had promised, the range banked and ticking softly, a kettle just off the boil pulled to the side of the hob. The scullery opened off it through a half-door. A large yellow bowl of peas stood on the scrubbed deal table, and a smaller bowl beside it, half full of pods. Maggie sat down at her place and resumed her work. After a moment, Miss Marple drew out the chair opposite and sat down too, and folded her hands on the table in front of her. For a little while neither of them spoke. The only sounds in the room were the soft tick of the range and the small dry rattle of peas falling into the bowl. Then Miss Marple said, "Maggie, I went to see your father yesterday." Maggie's hands did not stop. A pod opened. 4 peas fell. "Did you?" she said. "Yes." He was very lucid. He told me about the orchard, about what he heard from the terrace in October 1915, about Annie and the home in Somerset, and what Mrs. Eleanor Thorne said to her brother that afternoon. Another pod. 3 peas. Maggie's hands were entirely steady. "He shouldn't have told you. I have asked him not to." "He did not say it lightly. He said you didn't like him to speak of it." He looked frightened, Maggie. "Yes." "Well." Maggie reached for another pod. "He is 94. He frightens easily now. He didn't always. Maggie, I have also spoken to the vicar. He has told me about the baptism that was not entered in the register, and I have had Mr. Trescott in Exeter Wire, Somerset, for the certificate of your sister's death. I have the date and the cause. And yesterday morning, when I came up for the basket, I took the small tin from behind the bicarbonate in the dresser. It is at Mrs. Calloway's cottage. It is foxglove leaf. I think you know that it is." Maggie set down the pod she was holding. She put both hands flat on the table on either side of the yellow bowl. She looked, for the first time, at Miss Marple and her face. For one long moment before she gathered it back, was the face of a woman who had been holding her breath for 41 years and had at last been told she might let it out. "I wondered when you would come and ask me," she said. And Miss Marple, who had been preparing to be gentle, found that she did not need to be. It came out then in the warm kitchen, with the peas in the bowl and the range ticking, as quietly and as orderly as if Maggie had been telling a recipe. Annie at the house at 19. Mr. Hubert. Mrs. Eleanor's discovery. The place in Somerset, which Mrs. Eleanor had been told of by a cousin and had chosen because it was cheap, and because the woman who ran it asked few questions. The death in the November. The child sent on to Bristol. The years afterwards in which Maggie had stayed in the house and watched the family and decided, not all at once, but slowly, like a kettle coming to a boil over a banked fire, what she would do. I could not reach the mother. She died in her own bed of pneumonia in 37, with Miss Evangeline holding her hand. So it had to be the daughters, both. The name to die out, the house to go, Annie's account to be settled. You waited a long time. I waited until I was old enough to be thought past it, and I waited until my father was past being believed. I am sorry about that. He didn't deserve it, but I needed the time. And Miss Cordelia? Miss Cordelia was the easier one, the heart, the milk at night. She trusted me. I had been bringing her milk for 30 years. Maggie's voice did not change. It was not unkind, Miss Marple. I made it the way she liked it. I sat with her a moment after I gave it to her. She didn't suffer. The dose was right, and Miss Evangeline was to be next. Yes, in the spring, I had the way ready. I would not have hurried it. And Tom Verall. Here, for the first time, Maggie looked away. She looked at her hands on the table, and the lines about her mouth tightened. That was the part I did not like. I washed the second glass and put it back in the cabinet so that Mrs. Bly's seeing him would catch him out, and the inspector would have somewhere to look. That was not me. I would have brought him out of it, after Miss Evangeline. I had thought how. I would not have let them hang him. I had a letter written. It is in the dresser drawer upstairs. You can find it after. I believe you, Maggie. Yes. Well, she drew a long breath. She picked up a pod and looked at it and put it down again. In the hall, the front door opened very softly. There was the small sound of 2 men coming in and stopping and waiting. Maggie heard it. She did not turn her head. She smoothed her apron over her knees and stood up and looked down at the bowl of peas for a moment, as if there were one more she meant to shell and had decided not to. Then she looked across the table at Miss Marple. "Will someone see to my father, Miss Marple? At the home. He will not understand. I will see to it, Maggie. You have my word. Thank you." She walked out into the hall to Inspector Slack without being asked and without resistance, and she did not look back. Miss Marple and Hester walked home through the long blue dusk. They did not speak much. At Hester's gate, Miss Marple paused and looked back up the lane toward Thorn House. 2 windows on the first floor were lit. As she watched, one went dark. A moment later, the other. The Thorn House stood black against the cold, clear sky. She thought, walking up Hester's path, of a woman of 41 in Bristol who had been a child once in a handcart in October 1915, and who would not now be told. She had meant that morning to write a letter. She decided at Hester's door that she would not. Some accounts are settled, some are only set down.